What's up everybody? In today's video, I'll be breaking down the exact cost that I spent to build my tiny house on wheels. I'll also reveal some game-changing ways to cut costs that some people may or may not agree with. So let's jump right in. So there's two types of tiny houses that most people will discover when they have a little bit of land and they're looking to add an ADU, which is an accessory dwelling unit. The first are tiny homes on wheels, and the second are shed conversions. Now, they both have their own unique perks and advantages and challenges, but I tend to prefer THOWs, which are tiny homes on wheels. Now, what you'll never hear me say is that a THOW is easier to build, because they are not. But I do stand firm in my belief that they do tend to be more profitable as Airbnbs. So regarding the cost, I'm speaking from the perspective of someone who is not a professional carpenter or framer. You know, I had a little bit of experience with tools, but I was not a professional by any means. So, you know, if you're kind of in that boat, then this video is pretty much for you. The very first step is to buy a trailer. It's called a tiny house on wheels because, you know, it's built on the heavy duty steel frame of a trailer. So when I started my tiny house company, I rented a warehouse space where I built the tiny homes, and after they were all done, they were actually hooked up to a heavy duty pickup truck, a dually truck, or even something like a F-250, and it got delivered to customers that way. And here's the thing, you're building a house on top of a trailer. So it's extremely important that the trailer is heavy duty and it can handle the weight load and the weight capacity of a completed home. Think about everything that is included in a finished house, including the furniture and of course including the people. And with that being said, you'll need a trailer with a minimum weight capacity of 10,000 pounds, a 10K trailer. And all this means is that the trailer has two, aka tandem axles, and each of those axles can handle 5,000 pounds each. Now, if you have some extra money, I would totally go for a 14,000 pound capacity trailer. And all that means is that each of the two axles can handle 7,000 pounds each. But I would not, and I repeat, I would not recommend a trailer that can only carry a 7,000 pound capacity. And I have to mention this because the most common types of trailers that you're gonna find are trailers with a 7K capacity, meaning they have two 3,500 pound axles. Now listen, I understand the purpose and the vision behind the tiny house movement. It's all about living frugally and, you know, living below your means. So, you know, if you're strapped for cash and you have to go with a 7K trailer, you can use it, right? But I would recommend keeping that tiny house under 16 feet in length. Anything longer than that, and you're gonna risk building a house that is unsafe and is too heavy for the trailer that it's built on. So if you must go with a 7,000 pound trailer, keep that tiny house at a maximum length of 16 feet. So what's the cost of these trailers? Well, depending on the length of the trailer, the prices can vary greatly. But if you're building a tiny home that you'll be using as maybe an Airbnb rental, you'll likely be going with a 20-foot trailer, and you'll be looking at around $4,500 for a used one and up to about $7,500 for a brand new trailer. Now listen, when I built my tiny house, I built it on a 16-foot trailer, and I was able to score a used trailer on Facebook Marketplace with a 7,000 pound capacity for only $1,500. Now, it was a little beat up, and I did need to wire brush the rust off and give it a spray of like this rust resistant paint. But for me and my finances at the time, it was well worth it. So once you have your trailer, the next thing you'll be looking to do is build vertically. And so let's talk about the cost of the lumber needed to build a tiny home on wheels. And so for tiny homes, a good way to estimate the lumber cost is for each linear foot, you're gonna be looking at about $100. So for example, my 16-foot trailer cost me about $1,600 in lumber from Home Depot and Lowe's. So if you have maybe a 20-foot trailer, that'll cost you about $2,000 in lumber. If you have an 18-foot trailer, that'll cost you about $1,800 in lumber, and so on and so forth. So $100 per linear foot is a good way to think about your lumber cost. So the next thing to consider is who's gonna build this tiny home. A few years ago when I built my first tiny home, a question I really had to ask myself is it wise for me to put the structural integrity, the bones of the house into my own hands? I mean, think about it. If you had a broken bone in your body, your entire body would collapse. So this is honestly the most important part of building a tiny home when it comes to the strength and the structural integrity of the house is the framing. So you want this to be as strong and as professionally built as possible. So if you're not 100% confident that you can build a strong, sound, and safe house, I would consider outsourcing this part of the build. And guys, before we get too far, I do want to mention this very important thing. You're going to want to check with your city's zoning and planning department to make sure that you have the permits in place and, the paperwork necessary to begin building a tiny house or a shed conversion. This is very important because you don't want to get too far down the process and then realize that tiny homes aren't even allowed in your neighborhood. That could be a disaster. The other thing that's super important to the success of your tiny home build is you're gonna want a framing plan. You're gonna want an architectural drawing. You can actually do this yourself, or you can hire a structural engineer or an architect to draw up these plans for you so that you have a guide, a blueprint to go by when you're actually building the tiny house. If you don't have a blueprint, then how do you know what you're doing is right or wrong? But you can also find these framing plans online. So if you don't have the money to hire an architect or a structural engineer, you can actually buy the framing plans online, and that can serve as your blueprint for when you begin actually building the home. So let me go over how I found the best contractors for the best price. So I used an app called THOW to access contractors. For our purposes, THOW gives you access to independent framers, carpenters, electricians, plumbers, and you need to get multiple quotes and talk to each of them on the phone. You need to read their reviews and ultimately choose a contractor that works best for you. Another option is Google, but I would avoid the large commercial companies that usually occupy the top spots in the search results because, we're looking for a deal. So if you are going to use Google, find someone with 4.5 to 5 stars, but maybe they only have 10 reviews versus 1,000. But if you've got the money to spend, sure, go and hire a top tier construction company, and I'm sure they'll absolutely get it done. They'll do it properly and take all the stress off of you essentially being a project manager. But the caveat is, at their price point, you might as well purchase an already built tiny home from someone like me or other builders that actually specialize in tiny home construction. So now that we talked about THOW and Google, one of my secret weapons that I like to keep in my back pocket, if you're really looking to score a deal that might come with a little bit of risk, is Facebook Marketplace. Guys, I have found 3 of my best contractors via Facebook Marketplace, but I've also gotten screwed on there as well. So everyone thinks Facebook Marketplace is simply for buying and selling items, which it is, but let me tell you, a lot of talented contractors also use Facebook Marketplace to find customers. The contractors tend to be licensed electricians, plumbers, even tile guys that may work for a large commercial company like Mr. Plumber or Roto-Rooter. But these big commercial companies, they pay their employees hourly. So for example, my plumber might make $25 an hour working for Mr. Plumber. He might post an ad on Facebook Marketplace advertising himself, and he'll come out and do the plumbing job on my tiny house for $400. And if you know anything about plumbers and electric companies, sometimes they charge $100 just to show up and give you an estimate. And plumbing estimates can easily be upwards of $1,000 or $2,000 for a relatively simple job, but they may only pay their employees $25 to $25 an hour. So I could hire my plumber, pay him $400 to do a rough in, which is basically the first stage of plumbing, and $400 for a day of work might be what he makes in 2 or 3 days working at the job. So if they tell you, hey, listen, I'm available and I can easily get the job done, but I'm only available after 5 p.m. or on the weekends, this is an excellent sign because that tells you that they probably have a day job working professionally for a large commercial company. So that's the hack that I want you to keep in your back pocket. If you're feeling a little adventurous, or Thumbtack and Google just isn't working out for you, you might want to try Facebook Marketplace. Now don't tell them I sent you, just you might want to try it. Another somewhat sketchy option is if you live in a part of town where there's a lot of residential construction happening, you can actually walk onto one of those job sites and ask one of the guys if they're open to working on a side project that you might have for them. Tell them you're building a shed or a tiny house and you'd love to talk once they're off the clock. That's another way to get someone who is definitely qualified, because if they can build a big residential house in a community like that, then surely they can work on your tiny home. So without further ado, let's break down the cost of my tiny house. So we know I got a great deal on my trailer. I paid about $1,500 and then maybe another $100 in gas, the paint, the wire brush to get the rust off, and all of those things. Then I paid about $400 for a engineer on freelancer.com to take the framing plans that I actually drew on paper. Let me actually show it to you. Okay. So like I was saying, I actually paid someone $400 on Fiverr to take the framing plans that I drew on paper and convert them into digital drawings. So these are the actual framing plans that I used to let me know exactly how I should space the lumber, exactly where my windows should be, all of those things. And look, it's all beat up, The next cost is I paid a contractor $2,500 to actually complete the framing of the tiny house. Here we go. It's coming along. Got the experts out here. So the next costs are the framing materials. These are the 2x4s, the 2x6s, the OSB, the plywood, all of the framing materials needed to actually create the skeleton of the tiny house. This cost me $1,600. So the next thing I want to touch on are the windows. The windows in this tiny house, and there's a total of 6 of them. These 6 windows, believe it or not, cost me only $700. I mean, I sourced almost all of these windows off of Facebook Marketplace and they all work perfectly. Now, I did have to pay somebody literally $350 to install this large picture window. I hadn't yet installed a window that large before, so I didn't feel comfortable doing it and didn't want any air leaks. So I paid somebody $350, which was half the cost of all of these windows combined, just to install that large picture window. So you can see already how doing some of the labor yourself can save you probably thousands of dollars. Now, this is in no particular order, so I'm just kind of riffing right now. I paid about $250 for the spray foam installation, and I used spray foam insulation on the ceilings, and it cost me about $600 for the R19 insulation that I used in the wall cavities and in the floors. The next thing is the metal roofing. I got a crazy deal again on Facebook Marketplace. I paid $250 and that got me all of the metal roofing materials that I needed, and I actually ended up paying a contractor $450 to install all of the metal roofing on the tiny house. I also paid about $1,000 in siding materials. This is the material that goes on the outside of the OSB or the plywood walls. This is the skin of the tiny house. So I paid $1,000 for the materials, and I paid about $1,000 for the labor for a company to come out and actually install the siding on the tiny house. Another thing that we did to fortify and strengthen the tiny house is we used a lot of metal products such as aluminum flashing, which went underneath the floor joists. We used rafter ties, we used joist hangers, we used aluminum rods that ran from the top plate to the bottom plate and then got tied directly into the metal frame of the trailer. We added a lot of these things to increase the strength and rigidity of the tiny house, and that cost about $250. I did need to make some upgrades to the trailer when I got it, so I did pay a welder $250 to weld on additional steel supports onto the trailer. So this here front door, cost me about $400 on Facebook Marketplace. It was originally just a tan door and I was able to paint it red, and I just got a really great deal on this door. Another thing I paid for are the drywall materials. This is the 1/2-inch drywall, the drywall mud, the drywall tape. So I paid about $1,200 in material costs for the drywall, and I paid another $1,200 in labor costs for the drywall. The next big thing are the utilities. I'm talking about the plumbing, the electrical, and the HVAC. All in all, the plumbing cost me about $2,500. It cost about $1,000 in labor and about $1,500 in materials, and these material costs did include the tankless hot water heater. Also able to get this sink brand new, this brand new off of Wayfair, and the toilet brand new, all for about $850. So I paid about $1,600 for this shower system. That includes the waterproofing behind the shower walls. That includes about $400 worth of tile and about $900 worth of labor to install the tiles. So this shower system cost about $1,600, and then I paid another $250 for the shower door. Another thing I paid for was the electrical. Electrical all in, including the light fixtures and the wiring, ran me about $1,000. And this set of kitchen cabinets behind me cost me about $400. I got all the cabinets unfinished from Home Depot, and I was able to sand them, stain them, paint them, put on the cabinet pulls, all for about $400. Now, we do have to talk about the butcher block countertop. I got that butcher block countertop from IKEA, and it cost me roughly about $200. So I got these floors from a couple that was actually remodeling their home, and they had a 4,000 square foot house. It was a beautiful house, and they had about 250, 300 square feet left over, and I was able to get these floors from them, and these are luxury hardwood floors that I was able to get from them for basically dirt cheap. Now, this was an unexpected cost. I did not realize that the cost of baseboard and trim and casing for the doors and the windows were gonna be so expensive. So the total cost for just the baseboard and the trim, including the labor, it ran me about $800 to get that done. Oh, and don't forget the mini fridge. The mini fridge cost me about $200 as well. And I'll just go ahead and say about $1,000 in just miscellaneous items such as, paint, sandpaper, construction adhesive, nails, bolts, like all of these little things probably added up to another $1,000. So as you can see, my all-in cost for building the tiny house was $22,000. Now, I did forget to mention the mini split, which is the wall unit that heats and cools the tiny house. And you saw the breakdown. The cost of materials is high, and that's a fixed cost unless you can get lucky and find some great deals on Facebook Marketplace. Now, the cost of labor could go down significantly if you're good with your hands and you're good with working with tools, and maybe even get it down to under 20K. Now, all in all, I need to remind you that whether you're spending 25K, 35K, 20,000, look, you're getting a house for a fraction of the cost of traditional housing or a studio apartment. If you live in a major southern city like Atlanta or Charlotte or Dallas, you're paying a minimum of $1,500 a month for a small apartment. Now, $1,500 times 12 months is $18,000. So if you can build a tiny house for that price, you'll have something that you can own for the price of renting for 1 year. And I sometimes tell younger people that if you have the luxury of moving back home with your parents, or family for a year and living very cheaply and frugally and just stacking your paper, that year of savings could change the trajectory of your life forever. So, and this goes for older adults too. Some older adults might need to move, you 40 years old, 40 plus, you might need to move back in with grandma or your mama. Anyway, let me stop joking. So let me know in the comments if you have any additional cost-saving tips and tricks when it comes to building or construction. And if you got value from this video, go ahead and like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.